I held off doing a video on 3DFX's Voodoo graphics card for a few reasons. Not because I didn't want to, as the Voodoo is certainly the most famous and influential of early 3D accelerators, and as an enthusiast of the history of 3D in games, not to mention one running a channel dedicated to the topic, it sort of behooves me to talk about the Voodoo in some capacity. The problem is, it's been talked about many times in excellent videos by LGR, Tech Ambrosia, Rick's Random Retro, and as well as outside YouTube with written form articles, even books, and literal decades of online discussions, tests, and thorough deep dives. In short, the Voodoo has been covered to death. So, what new ground, if any, could I possibly uncover? Certainly nothing about the standard Voodoo 4 meg, which we all know and love. Of course, this was originally released in late 1996, but there were, of course, the somewhat more exotic variants a little later, like the well-known Canopus Pure 3D, which had 6 megabytes memory. If you want to get really exotic, there were even a couple 8 megabyte cards made by companies like Skywell, a truly rare item nowadays, but one which doubled both the texture memory and the frame buffer. This meant that the infamous hard limit of a 640 by 480 resolution could finally be shattered, meaning that yes, you could own a Voodoo that ran games at up to 800 by 600, a truly high-definition experience by the standards of the late 90s. By 1998, 3DFX was ready to launch a successor worthy of its world-changing product, the Voodoo 2. Fundamentally, not much had changed. It was still a pure 3D accelerator broken out into multiple chips, with one key difference. 3DFX added a second TMU and a third bank of memory, dramatically increasing performance in games of the late 90s that pushed multi-texturing effects even harder. And the rest, as they say, is history. Well, sorta. That's the history we know on the consumer side of things. But there also existed an entirely different, alternate side to the story, by way of a company called Quantum 3D. Quantum 3D was a subsidiary of 3DFX which focused on professional workstations and high-end arcade machines. Fundamentally, their products were built using the same underlying chips and technology, but being that they catered to a much more lucrative market, they could offer much higher end and often much more extreme variations than were available to everyone else. For instance, did you know the original Voodoo architecture supported SLI? While consumers would have to wait for the Voodoo 2 for the privilege, high-dollar customers of Quantum 3D could enjoy dual 3DFX cards as early as 1996 with the Obsidian Pro line. But what's more, some of these cards had an extra daughter card that could plug on top. This housed a separate texture unit with its own memory, allowing for dual texture mapping units on 3DFX's first 3D accelerator. In effect, 3DFX had created not only the fastest 3D accelerator in the world in 1996, but also the first truly scalable and fully modular 3D architecture outside of the workstation world. And I don't know about you, but I'm feeling like we kind of got a little shortchanged. What if consumers, the humble PC gamers of the late 90s, got to own a truly maxed out Voodoo graphics card? What if we got to find out for ourselves what it was really capable of? Well, folks, just hang tight for a moment. I've got something to show you. This is PixelPipes. This package comes all the way from Romania, by way of the Netherlands. I had a couple people help get this to my door, but there's something really special inside. I'm sure you can see where this is going, but hang tight for a second. We got a few things here to talk about, and we'll get to this crazy thing in a moment, but yeah, let's get this thing unboxed here. Well, I have to say, this is all very well packaged, but this gorgeous thing is what finally prompted me to talk about the Voodoo. This is a creation by an individual online that goes by SDZ. He has a website, sdz-mods.com, and on there you'll find various blog posts with custom designed Voodoo cards. Mainly Voodoo cards. There's a couple other things on there as well. And he creates these elaborate professional quality designs and he just publishes them. You can send them out to your PCB maker of choice and put them together, solder them up. He doesn't actually manufacture these cards, and that's critical to note. He is just an engineer, designer, not a manufacturer. He does not sell these already made up. So if you wanted one, you would have to have the means to do it yourself. One of the craziest things that he has is this monstrosity here. It's pretty cool to have even just a blank PCB of this thing, but yeah, this is gorgeous looking. I'm probably gonna hang this on the wall, maybe even like back here behind the camera, on the back wall there, look pretty good. But we'll get to what this thing is later, as well as some other goodies he sent along. For now, let's turn our focus to this enhanced Voodoo graphics card and what it is that makes it so special. To do that, let's first pull out a standard Voodoo, because I think by comparing the two, the differences will become immediately apparent. The most blatant difference is that there are more 3DFX branded chips on the 4440H. In fact, there are 2 TMUs in addition to the single FBI chip. That's, of course, twice as many TMUs as on the original Voodoo, making it more similar to a Voodoo 2. Flipping it over, you could see there's also quite a few more memory ICs than on the original. And if we take a look at the rear, there's even a mini HDMI compatible port. So in short, SDC didn't leave anything untouched on this card. But how is this possible? How can you just add another TMU to the Voodoo? To answer that, we have to understand a bit about what made the original Voodoo tick. And for that, we're going to need to get a little technical. The Voodoo, or SST1 architecture, is in some ways simple and yet incredibly sophisticated. Incidentally, as I learned from Tech Ambrosia,
SST, the name of the Voodoo chipset, stands for Sellers, Smith, and Turoli. The more you know.
One aspect of the SST1's design is that you could just about discern how it works just by looking at it. You've got the 2 large 3DFX branded ASICs here, and then next to each one are 4 EDO memory chips, each row being 2 megabytes. Because each row is connected directly to the adjacent ASIC, they function as 2 completely separate banks. While altogether they total 4 megabytes memory on the card, their separation means they can't all be used as one big memory pool like on a traditional graphics card. The bank connected to the FBI or frame buffer chip can only be used for Z buffer and, of course, the frame buffer, which is usually double buffered, although triple buffering was supported. The texture mapping unit, or T-Rex chip, as 3DFX referred to it, uses its memory for, brace yourselves, texture data. Now, each chip's data bus to memory is 64 bits wide, and at the time, a 64-bit bus was pretty typical in the mid-90s for 2D and even most competing 3D accelerators. But because you have 2 of them, it means that you have an effective memory interface of 128 bits, which makes it a whole lot more impressive. And hey, if that were the end of the story, it would already be pretty good. But the special sauce of the Voodoo graphics goes much deeper than that. As Gary Tiroli and Scott Sellers explain, the T-Rex chip supports 4-way memory interleave, which was essential to the speed of its operation.
And then the texture mapping chip had 4 memory channels, which was important because in order to do bilinear texture mapping, which is basically when you look up a texture, you're looking up its 4 surrounding neighbors and taking a weighted average of those 4. So again, having those 4 memory channels on the texture mapping chip was a critical piece of being able to do this in a performant way.
The reason for this is that by having 4 interleaved channels, data accesses can be done regardless of if an address is being used for other data accesses. In simpler terms, it prevents stalls and allows for much more work to be done in parallel without the need for a massive number of pins. Using bilinear filtering on textures typically took 4 times the work, but because T-Rex has 4 memory channels that can do 4 simultaneous 16-bit texel reads on a 64-bit bus, they can do bilinear filtering with no performance cost. That was something completely unheard of at the time. The FBI chip similarly supports interleaving, the only 2-way, which allows for color and Z data access to be done together. 2 pixels and their accompanying Z attributes could be batched together and read and written at a time, both 16-bit, fully utilizing the 64-bit bus used for the memory interface. In most scenarios, the FBI was generating 1 pixel per clock cycle, consistent with a single pipe architecture. Beyond this point, though, we get into some, let's say, hazier aspects of the Voodoo's architecture, because unfortunately, 3DFX didn't disclose every detail in their technical documents. Now, let me just reiterate, I'm neither a programmer or a hardware engineer, but I'll try and explain it as accurately as I possibly can. Thankfully, I've had the benefit of SDZ's invaluable insight and expertise. Not only is he someone that's completely reverse engineered the Voodoo and Voodoo 2, he's also publicly released his schematics and generously offered his time to answer my questions about it. One aspect in particular has been the center of some of this uncertainty, and it has to do with how the FBI and TMU are connected to each other. This article by Fabian Sanglard, which has been a treasure trove of information for this video on the Voodoo's architecture, claims that the interface between the FBI and the TMU is 64 bits. But even he admits that this piece of information was something he inferred, and this is where SDZ's hardware engineering chops have been able to help fill in the gaps. SDZ has determined the link between the FBI and TMU is actually 2 16-bit interfaces, and he believes they're likely double data rate, similar to the Voodoo 2. One 16-bit bus connects directly to TMU0, which sends finished texel data to the FBI. A 16-bit DDR bus is enough for the TMU to send up to 2 batch 16-bit RGBA color pixels to the FBI chip in a single clock cycle. But remember I mentioned 2 interfaces. The other 16-bit bus is T-branched from the FBI to each TMU, allowing texture data to be written to each bank of texture memory, accessed individually thanks to separate addresses configured via strap registers. Data can only be written, not read directly from texture memory, so the TMU must always send data back as texel values. But what's neat is that the TMUs themselves contain another 16-bit expansion bus just for connecting additional texture units, and this is what allows the Voodoo to have not just 2, but up to 3 T-Rex chips chained together to a single FPI. This is just wild, and believe it or not, such a configuration did get produced by a company called Primary Image in 1997 with their Piranha card, which also featured an integrated MIPS CPU that ran an embedded version of Glide to run their Tempest visual simulator software, according to the Dodge Garage website. Utter insanity. Multiple TMUs can be used to perform more advanced multi-texturing effects in a single pass, and these texture operations are performed on a scanline basis, each scanline referred to as a fragment. This scanline-based operation is a critical element that's important to understanding how the Voodoo operates. Basically, the FBI takes triangles generated by the CPU and converts them to scanline requests, which are then issued to the TMUs. The TMUs take care of all texturing operations, including LOD MIP mapping, filtering, and perspective correction division, before being sent back as 16-bit RGBA color values, or texels, to the FBI, which then performs a Z-buffer test, applies a colored lighting value, and if desired, alpha blending and a fog table lookup. It's thanks to the scanline approach that the Voodoo is also capable of scanline interleave, or SLI, just like the Voodoo 2. Home consumer variants of these first-generation cards were never produced with SLI enabled, but Quantum 3D cards certainly were, and you can see examples here of their Obsidian Pro 100dB 4440 in a dual card configuration connected via a ribbon cable. or the 100SB4400V, which has SLI on a single board. Both cards could have a second TMU attached via a separate module, which on the non-SLI 4440 was called an Amethyst card. There are many more reasons why the Voodoo performed as fast as it did, particularly on the software side, from the low-level register commands in the API to a memory-backed programmable command FIFO, which basically made it possible to queue up thousands of write commands without waiting for them to finish, something John Carmack once said was a key to sustained performance. Alright, but I can hear some of you saying, that's all great, but what does all that technical gobbledygook actually mean? Basically, it meant the Voodoo was fast. I mean, insanely fast, given the number of transistors, the limited 50 MHz clock speed, and the data bandwidth they had available. 3DFX designed the Voodoo to be lean and mean, and to not waste clock cycles on extra work or stalls in the pipeline. An article on vintage3d.org describes it like this, saying, Voodoo is close to single-cycle performance and sustains 30 million bilinear filtered textured pixels per second in non-trivial scenarios. This was in essence untouchable by even their closest competitors. Efficiency was the most crucial ingredient, allowing the Voodoo to punch above its weight. But the decision to make it a dedicated 3D accelerator was also an avant-garde move, even for the time, but it meant that every element could be singularly built for that purpose, with whatever proprietary internal designs they could come up with. Breaking out the architecture into multiple chips also meant they could have many more transistors than others could with just a single chip built on TSMC's 350nm process, and it gave them more pins for I/O, something that was quite limited on typical quad flat pack chips of the era. In short, it was a smart design by some very smart people, and proof that 3DFX, more than anyone else at the time, knew what they were doing. So back to this modern work of art by STZ, which he calls the Voodoo 4440H. As the name would suggest, this card was heavily inspired by Quantum 3D's SB50-4440. Like the Quantum 3D card, this one maxes out the memory each chip can support. And so you've got 4 megabytes on each TMU, as well as on the FBI, totaling 12 megabytes. This isn't a straight-up clone of Quantum 3D's card, however. On the SB50 card, the second TMU was an optional Amethyst daughter card, which has obviously been simplified here. Importantly, though, due to the design differences, this card isn't compatible with the drivers for the SB50, which will have some ramifications we'll get to here in a moment. As SDZ explains, the main differences stem from the lack of a CPLD security chip, and because the layout is different, various timings between the chips won't be the same, which is critical on the SST1 architecture given how tight and efficient its operation is. You can, however, load a standard Voodoo driver and have it work fine, provided you boot your OS with these parameters added to your autoexec.bat, which help compensate for the timing differences. Quantum's drivers ignore these parameters and so won't work on this card. But despite the fact that 3DFX never made a consumer Voodoo card with this dual TMU configuration, most games work just fine with its driver, and as we'll see soon, the performance implications are pretty astounding. As an aside, I'm told the theoretical maximum of 3 TMUs will not work on any released driver, so 2 TMUs is really the limit for normal software. However, there's a big catch, unfortunately, so let's just get it out of the way right now. This card does not support direct 3D games, like at all. Glide games and games using a mini GL patch work fine, but the rather large number of early direct 3D games, like Forsaken, they won't even start on it. And this is a direct result of not being able to use Quantum 3D's drivers. And despite our best efforts, neither SDZ or I have been able to cobble anything together with the various driver files to make Direct3D work, aside from this cube test, which only functions because there's no textures being applied. So, a bit of a bummer for sure, but nonetheless, the majority of games people are likely to play on a Voodoo are going to be running Glide, and thanks to that HDMI output, they've never looked more crisp and clean. SDZ utilizes a Spartan 7 FPGA with his own custom code for extracting the RGB values going into the RAM DAC and deciphering the unique timing signals, which, according to him, was the toughest part of the project. As you can see from this footage, the image quality going into my capture card is fantastic, and it's even better when using integer scaling. Of course, analog output from an original Voodoo will also look really good with integer scaling, but it'll never quite match a direct digital signal coming right off the FBI. Lastly, the extra memory chips help ensure that the Voodoo's chipset always runs at peak performance, and even allows the card to render at 800 by 600, although since the driver isn't optimized for it, you do have a gamma bug which makes the rendering particularly dark, and trying to change the gamma from the auto exec or within the driver's control panel apparently doesn't affect this. By the way, the extra memory can be disabled using these tiny dip switches if you so desire, though I never found a need to mess with them. Let's find out how much more performance a Voodoo can offer when it's fully unleashed with 2 TMUs and the maximum amount of memory. I fired up my slot 1 Pentium III running at 700 MHz to ensure there's no performance hindrance from the system, and got to work benchmarking the 4440H against a standard 4 meg Voodoo. Unfortunately, I only had 4 games compatible with the 4440H with built-in benchmarks, leaving out anything that uses Direct3D since, as I mentioned, they won't run on it. We'll start with what's perhaps the most important game to the early success of the Voodoo, Quake. The original Voodoo was considered blazingly fast at the time, getting 36.6 FPS at 640 by 480. But with a second TMU, the enhanced Voodoo rockets through light maps at an astonishing 57.3 FPS. These extra 20.7 frames make it almost 57% faster. Id's follow-up, Quake 2, increased the graphical demands quite a bit from its predecessor, and here the Voodoo got 26.3 FPS at 640 by 480, which would have likely prompted some users to lower the resolution, especially during multiplayer matches. But had they been able to buy 4440H back in 1997, they would have ripped through Quake 2 at a whopping 38.6 FPS, an improvement of about 47%. Epic Games was also pushing the envelope back in the day, and the game that launched a gaming engine juggernaut was Unreal. This pushed even the latest cards like the Voodoo 2 and Riva TNT to the limit in 1998, but if you weren't too picky, you could still play it on the venerable old 4 meg Voodoo. The torturous Castle Flyby demo at the opening of the game, that was most often used for benchmarking the game, only gets you 20.1 FPS at 640 by 480. But on a fully unleashed Voodoo, that number jumps to a much more playable 32.2, an insane increase of 60%. And then one of the last Glide games to still support the original Voodoo was Epic's Unreal Tournament, released in 1999. The opening cinematic benchmark for this game is actually a little easier to run than its single-player focused predecessor, and a Voodoo can get you 26.1 FPS at its max supported resolution. Add a second TMU and a bunch more memory? Well, then you get 36.8 FPS, a still respectable jump of 41%, which is only marred due to some minor texture rendering issues in some places. Despite that though, again, this is a cutting-edge game from freaking 1999, running smoothly at high settings on a 3D accelerator launched in 1996. Frankly, this doesn't even seem like it should be possible, and it's a testament to how brutally powerful and forward-looking the Voodoo's design was. But why stop there? This card is also capable of running games at 800 by 600, so of course we've got to check that out as well. Again, bear in mind that due to a driver bug, games can appear pretty dark at that resolution, so I'll have to boost the gamma a bit here in editing so you can see it better. Running Quake at 800 by 600 drops the frame rate down to 35.5 FPS, which, funny enough, is almost identical to the frame rate the original Voodoo got at 640 by 480, and it's perfectly playable at this higher resolution. In Quake 2, the time demo drops to 24 FPS at this resolution, a steep drop of about 38%, which isn't particularly smooth by most people's standards, but it is cinematic. Unreal's tortured test drops down to the high teens, which is again almost spot on to what the original Voodoo got at 640 by 480, which means that in-game performance is relatively playable at 800 by 600 on the enhanced Voodoo. Unreal Tournament takes a nosedive though, dropping all the way down to 21.8 FPS, which is fairly representative of in-game performance, where even in a small map it's hovering around the high teens to low 20s. Comment down below if you used to play this game at frame rates like these on budget hardware back in the day. So yes, you can sometimes play games on a beefed up Voodoo at 800 by 600, but not often. That being said, the performance uplift over a standard Voodoo at 640 by 480 is still insane, owing to the frequent use of multi-texturing effects in games of the late 90s, taking full advantage of that second TMU. Across the 4 games tested, it averaged 51.3% higher frame rates, but with swings between 60 and 41%, that really doesn't give the full picture, and I wish I could run more games, including direct 3D titles, to get a bigger sample size. But what's here still shows some pretty dramatic results. Wow, I have to be honest. While I expected some substantial gains, I never expected anywhere close to what I ended up getting. In fact, when I first tested the Voodoo 4440H, it was in a more period-correct PC with the Pentium MMX at 200 MHz, and in there the gains were a lot smaller and even sometimes non-existent. When I went to a Pentium II, I about fell out of my chair. I had to keep rechecking the results. In fact, when I shared that with SDZ, even he was blown away. He hadn't tested it on a fast CPU, so he actually had no idea what it was really capable of. And remember, these are the same chips running at the same clock speed as the original Voodoo. This is what its architecture is truly capable of. To put this in perspective, had the Voodoo originally launched with 2 TMUs like this one, it wouldn't be until 2 years later in 1999 when other companies could even catch up. Of course, it would have also been insanely expensive, and as I found out, CPUs of the period weren't even fast enough to show its actual performance uplift. So it wouldn't have made much sense, but it would have been absolutely crazy. Practical or not, though, this is exactly the sort of thing I love exploring. It's academic, sure, but giving graphics cards the means to show their full potential is literally what this channel is all about. And sometimes we find out things we wouldn't have ever known otherwise. The Voodoo was already fast, but I would have never guessed it had so much more potential in its design, just waiting to be let loose. It only deepens my appreciation for how incredible 3DFX's first product truly was. Clearly, SDZ also shares a passion for exploring potential performance, which brings me back to this thing right here. I promised I'd explain what it was, and well, basically it's just a Voodoo 2. Yeah, so anyway, thank you for watching. It's 2 Voodoo 2s in SLI on a single card. That's pretty cool, and such cards did exist back in the day from, who else, Quantum 3D, though admittedly it wasn't quite as mind-blowing by the time the second generation Voodoo launched, since SLI was finally brought to the consumer market by then, and users could easily replicate the performance at home with 2 cards. And well, yeah, there's some other stuff going on here as well. There's a spot for a 3rd TMU per FBI, so that's the maximum supported. There's also enough pads for 8 memory chips on each 3DFX ASIC, meaning there's potentially 32 megabytes of memory on this card. Oh, and there's an HDMI output and an HDMI input, not sure which is which, and a PCI Express connector. Yeah. And when it's all put together, it's sitting in an incredible plexiglass enclosure with RGB lighting and 2 blower fans. And lastly, there's also another connector over here, which, yep, theoretically lets you connect a second one to this. Now, does any of this actually work? Yes, absolutely. Sort of, almost. It's very much a work in progress, particularly on the software side of things. But SDC has some videos of it partially working, and I'll link to those in the description down below. SDZ has made some amazing things, like a Voodoo 4 and 5 that work in a laptop's MXM slot, as well as an HDMI add-on that clips over the RAM DAC chip of a Voodoo 2, and another Voodoo 1 that keeps the original single TMU configuration, but still adds HDMI output and additional memory. It's even more incredible that those designs are open source and freely available to anyone. I'd love to say that they're easy to make, but a lot of the cards require BGA soldering, FPGA programming, numerous EEPROMs, and lots of tiny SMDs. But if you had the money and connections to a manufacturer, or happen to have the skills yourself, it's only a matter of sourcing the parts, and away you go. Anyway, I think that will just about do it for this episode. Once again, I want to extend my enormous gratitude to SDZ for his time in providing technical information and for reaching out and sending me one of his test cards so I could evaluate it for this video. This is, without a doubt, one of my most treasured possessions in my collection now, and the perfect excuse for finally making a video about 3DFX's legendary Voodoo graphics. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I hope to see you again for the next one. Until then, I'm Nathan, and this has been PixelPipes.